Whenever you're ready, Paul, please.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much for the lovely introduction. You can all hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, I'll just share my slides. Content here. Okay, and you can all see my slides now, yeah?
Yes, can.
Right, perfect. Yeah, so yeah, thanks for the invitation to talk. So I'll get started. Yeah, so in 1618, Henry Goodcall had been appointed the chaplain of Newgate. The prison where felons set to be executed in London each month spent their final days. Goodcall would subsequently pioneer a pamphlet genre that captured the interest of a large sway of the populace, focused on relaying the story of the ordinary, lowly felon whose story was designed to be relatable to the readers. This was in contrast to the rather fantastical or incredulous crime pamphlets of the past. One of the first stories that Goodcall relayed after his appointment was on Elizabeth Sawyer, who was executed in 1621 for witchcraft. Goodcall's comments in his pamphlet demonstrate the reason he and the church that he was a part of believed that Sawyer needed to be punished. Quote, it is none of my intent here to discuss or dispute of witches or witchcraft, unquote. For Goodcall, Sawyer's guilt lay in her relationship with the devil. The general public, however, were fascinated by and believed that her guilt lay directly in her magical powers. The church, represented by Goodcall, wished to ground Sawyer's story as a moral crime of rejecting the church, and not the quote unquote ridiculous fictions as Goodcall described the stories of her magical powers. Uh, so as we and most of us probably know, witchcraft was a very difficult crime to prove in the early modern period, as it left little physical evidence. The clergy were generally unfavourable to popular ideas of witchcraft, while the views of legal professionals in the courts often aligned closely with popular ideas. For religious writers, Maleficium, i.e., the causing of harm or death, was considered secondary to the main crime of entering a pact with the devil. In contrast, popular perceptions of witchcraft focused almost entirely on its physical manifestations. Particularly after the English Reformation, the proof for witchcraft for clergymen constituted a range of personal behaviours, such as swearing or blaspheming, which are believed to be caused by the devil, and specifically not on manifestations of magic. For the public, however, the crime of witchcraft lay in how the witch had used her power to harm her society and harm her neighbours. And the tension between this theological versus popular conception of witchcraft is evident in Goodcall's writing. Witchcraft pamphlets in this period invariably focused on old, widowed, and poor women, and often focused on trial accounts of witches, particularly on the effort to prove the legal basis for witchcraft, which suggests that skepticism of the actual crime of witchcraft was rather widespread in society. The difficulty of proving the crime and the tendency for society to accuse those most vulnerable led some to condemn the prosecution of witchcraft as a relic of the past and specifically as a holdover of Catholic superstition. Reginald Scott, for example, in 1584, when we see his pamphlet on the slide here, expressed concern for the aged and the poor in society, whom he believes were the main victims of superstitions by common folk. In what is seen as largely as a response to Scott's skepticism, King James I published Demonology, 1597, and we see again on the slide, which was designed to offer a legal framework to prosecute witches. Though focused on the legal basis of witchcraft, the pamphlet itself is actually full of fantastical stories of Maleficium, of witches harming cattle, of causing raging seas, of bewitching cats, etc. A few years after the pamphlet, James would modify the Blasphemy Act, or modify the Witchcraft Act, I should say, making the crime a felony crime tried in the criminal courts as opposed to the ecclesiastical courts. The act allowed for the prosecution of witches based on a pact with the devil. Despite this act and pamphlets arguing that witchcraft was a pressing concern, perhaps due to a general skepticism of witchcraft as a crime. Witchcraft prosecutions were actually on the decline in this period, in the late 16th and early 17th century, and did not rise to any great extent until the 1640s. Likely because of this decline, there was a general lack of publication for several years on witchcraft and witch trials until the wonderful discovery genre, as I've coined it, emerged in the 1610s. The first was Thomas Pott's wonderful discovery in 1613, seen here on the slide, which was written by Thomas Pott, who was the court clerk at the trial, at the request of the two judges. So the pamphlet was designed to justify the execution of several people, mostly women, for witchcraft. The clerk wishes to explain the quote diverse and certain reports and relations of such evidences of witchcraft, consisting of the death, injury, or madness of neighbours or animals, which counted as proof, Pott argued, because, quote, there could not be so great fire without some smoke, unquote. We see here how legal definitions of witchcraft seem to align with popular beliefs in witchcraft as a crime that manifested in one's physical harm caused to others via their magical powers. This pamphlet was followed a year later by Witches Apprehended on the execution of the quote poor widow Sutton, unquote, and her daughter. Again, the story and the court proceedings that the story is based on focus on the various calamities that befell their neighbours. Although the devil is the instigator of the evil, he is not the main focus of the story. And a ballad was also published on the same story that same year, containing many of the common tropes of witchcraft, of swearing, of blaspheming, of the devil appearing as a familiar, of cattle being injured, and children dying. And you can see the verse in the slide where many of the common tropes of the devil appearing as a familiar and of swearing and blaspheming appear in the ballad. The ballad itself also contains a woodcut that you can see here, and you'll see a better version in the next slide, of stereotypical witches on the left. So, yeah, witches are depicted as old women with canes, with pointed fingers, with scowling faces, and bewitched animals. And while witchcraft continued to pass through the courts, it was not for another 60 years until 1619 that another witch trial account surfaced on the execution of Joan Flower and her daughter and her daughters in Lincolnshire. The pamphlet focuses specifically on defending the sentence of death imposed on these women. As we can see, the woodcut from the ballad is being reused from 6 years earlier, which was common for pamphlets in this period. So these woodcuts generally added a sense of continuity for readers. So the images served as an archetypal figure that readers could easily understand. They could see this image and either be reminded of a ballad they'd read earlier, or very quickly be aware of the theme of the pamphlet and the story. And the wonderful discovery title is also being reused again. The writer of this pamphlet wishes to avoid the quote contentious arguments about the discourse's distinctions or definitions of witchcraft, unquote. And the writer hopes that his story will convince those who claim one of two things: one, that women confessed to witchcraft by quote extremity of torture, unquote, and two, that witchcraft consists of ancient examples only. So, as we see, not only did all the concerns of witchcraft was a relic of the past and superstitions persist, but new concerns seemingly emerged in this period because of the modification of the Witchcraft Act by James I earlier in the century, which allowed for prosecution based on an admission of guilt by the accused witch. Evidently, concerns that confessions were obtained under torture have become more widespread in society. So 2 years later, in 1621, when Goodcall wrote his piece on Sawyer, it was at a time when prosecutions for witchcraft had dropped, and a discourse on witches concerned skepticism, the validity of confession under torture, and the role of Maleficium as evidence versus the devil. Goodcall, only of the authors mentioned just far, who was not writing solely from a legal perspective, though he does wish to legitimate the court sentence. He also wishes to express a message about witchcraft from the perspective of a clergyman. Some of the authors discussed thus far expressed the desire to avoid discussing the validity of witchcraft, knowing how contentious the topic is, while simultaneously offering tantalizing details on witchcraft and its manifestations. Goodcall is the only writer who acknowledges the debates on witchcraft, but actually dismisses the defensive ideas of Maleficium entirely, even the evidence in the court, and instead tries to focus solely on the role of the devil. So to get into Goodcall, so as Newgate chaplain, Goodcall was guaranteed access to felons whose stories he used to publicise his message at a time of religious polarisation, as well as the sole commercial right to do so. He wished to show in his writings how he had made the felon confess, while also discussing the danger of sin and offering details on crime to interest the reader. His writing also served a legal purpose, as he was employed by the civil government. He needed to create a narrative to justify the crime for the court and the reader. And we see here on the slide why Goodcall published stories about felons, and this quote is from his first pamphlet that dying men's words are ever remarkable. And as a reader of Calvinist and Proto-Puritan writers like William Perkins, Goodcall viewed witchcraft as a symptom of the devil that manifested in one's personal behaviour, not in magic. Goodcall often complained in his writings about the many rumours and, quote, untruths, unquote, that he had read in recent crime pamphlets, which he wished to combat. As the officially licensed writer, Goodcall believed that non-official pamphlets had affected the public perception of the justice system. Goodcall only wrote about certain felons. He deliberately chose the story of interesting felons who were already capturing the public's interest, who were already being discussed in London, or already had pamphlets written about them. And his first execution pamphlet after his appointment as a chaplain was on Sawyer. So Elizabeth Sawyer was the very person whom Reginald Scott warned would be the victim of witchcraft hysteria. Sawyer lived in Edmonton, a village near London. She was a spinster who lived on the fringes of her society. Edmonton already had a reputation for the supernatural. A play about magic, performed in the early 17th century, was set there, and we see it on the slide, The Merry Devil of Edmonton. Sawyer's neighbours had long suspected her of witchcraft due to the death of children and cattle and interference with crops in her village. Sawyer was tried at the Old Bailey Court in London for being, quote, seduced by the devil, unquote, to kill her neighbour. During her trial, along with the testimony of her neighbours, a strange mark was found on her body, and Sawyer was subsequently sentenced to be hanged. In his pamphlet on Sawyer, Goodcall wants to, quote, defend the truth, which received wound already by most base and false ballads, unquote. His pamphlet opens by acknowledging the disagreements about witchcraft in society, or the diversity of opinions, as Goodcall claims. Rather than tackling witchcraft, Goodcall instead cautions readers, as I mentioned at the start, it is none of my intent here to discuss or dispute of witches or witchcraft. Goodcall declines throughout the narrative to tackle witchcraft. He even questions the evidence presented in the court. Goodcall begins his pamphlet by condemning the superstitions of Sawyer's neighbours and even the justice of the peace who had arrested Sawyer. Goodcall even describes her trial as slight and ridiculous, and writes that the trial merely, quote, settled the resolution in those whom it concerned. Goodcall was more interested in Sawyer's confession. Sawyer admitted to Goodcall that her years of cursing, swearing, and blaspheming had allowed the devil access to her. The sins of swearing and drunkenness and sexual immorality was increasingly considered by Calvinist and Proto-Puritan writers in this period as a crime that had transgressed society, not as a private sin. For Goodcall, Sawyer's case shows the dangers of such sins. They had drawn the devil towards her, which resulted in the death of her neighbours and eventually her own demise. The main section of the pamphlet is dedicated to Goodcall's sessions with Sawyer at Newgate, while Sawyer was awaiting her execution. Goodcall interrogated her at Newgate, akin to a trial, by asking her 13 questions, all related to Sawyer's relationship with the devil. How she had allowed the devil to control her, what she had asked the devil to do, and what the devil had asked her to do. Gukal is not interested in any fanciful stories of witches or magic. His questions entirely concern how Sawyer fell into sin by accepting the devil, which had been precipitated by smaller sins of cursing and blaspheming. Sawyer was set to be executed at Tyburn, 3 miles west of London. And we see the route here she would have taken from Newgate Prison to Tyburn, her execution site. Gukal writes that at Tyburn, he recited her answers to the crowd that had gathered. Her confession, which had been induced at Newgate, was, quote, confirmed in the hearing of many hundreds, unquote. Gukal finishes his speech at Tyburn to the crowd by declaring, telling them to take heed of Sawyer's death as a warning of the dangers of the devil. Sawyer is rendered entirely silent, I should say, in Gukal's retelling. As he writes, at her trial, the devil had fled, leaving her to shift and answer for herself. In her final hour, how Sawyer had condemned herself, her tongue had abandoned her. Instead, Gukal speaks for her at Tyburn in a direct converse of how the devil had spoken for her. In this period in England, death was an important event on the road to salvation. How one died, particularly one's vocal performance, was considered to be crucial in achieving salvation, and for felons as well. Sawyer's final punishment for accepting the devil is to be denied a voice to confess. Instead, as Gukal frames the story, it is through Gukal's work, his voice, his pen, all blessed by God, that Sawyer is able to confess, and Gukal believes that Sawyer is able to achieve salvation. As he concludes his story on Sawyer, quote, the body law was justly inflicted, but mercy in God's power reserved to bestow when and where he pleaseth. Now, apart from the pamphlet title, the court record recited by Gukal, and his declarations to avoid the topic entirely, witchcraft is entirely absent from his narrative. Gukal never condemns Sawyer as a witch, asks her questions related to witchcraft, or mentions the word witch or witches or magic or powers in his speech at Tyburn. He focuses instead on the dangers of cursing and blaspheming the devil. His conviction was so strong, perhaps, to not dwell on these fanciful stories, because while returning from Tyburn to London, Gukal heard many base and false ballads being sung by the crowd around him. The ballads on Sawyer are unfortunately lost, but Gukal's comments reveal their content. And we see on the slide here, so Gukal describes them as being ridiculous fictions of her bewitching corn on the ground, of a ferret and an owl, of the bewitched woman braining herself, of the devil appearing to her in Newgate, all of which had been, quote, shamelessly printed and openly sung. The ballads evidently focus on the stereotypes that we've noted have appeared in countless pamphlets on witchcraft, especially the ballad on the trial in Lincolnshire we looked at earlier. All topics, all of which Gukal wished to avoid. So popular was Sawyer's story that ballads were printed and memorable enough to be sung in the 5 days between her trial and execution. Gukal wished to turn the crowd and readers' attention towards his message and away from these stories, which he described as being fit for an ale bench. I would argue, however, that Gukal was aware of this contradiction and actually tried to embrace the dichotomy, both to sell pamphlets and ensure that gospelers received his message about the devil. The pamphlet layout suggests he conceded that readers were interested in fanciful stories. His title directly mentions witchcraft in italics. Only in the subtitle is the main focus of the devil mentioned. And the part of the front of the parts most starkly from his message is the woodcut. So I see here on the slide the woodcut from his first pamphlet on Francis Robinson, which contains no depiction at all. But his pamphlet on Sawyer has an ornate cover with several stereotypes of witches, all the stereotypes that Gukal painfully avoided. There's a cane, long fingers, a scowling face, a snake, and a frog. Despite the focus of his prose, Gukal clearly catered to the public's interest in fanciful stories with his front page. This image would attract readers who understood the stereotypes and had heard the stories about Sawyer, such as those who attended her execution and some of those ballads. Perhaps Gukal hoped that they would be initially attracted by the image and title, but didn't consume his didactic message. Many of the other witchcraft pamphlets that we've discussed so far also contain depictions, and Gukal was evidently inspired by the success of these other pamphlets and was aware of the formula that needed to sell witchcraft stories. And even the depiction of Sawyer is very reminiscent in reverse of one of the depictions of the witches here on the right. Yet these other pamphlets embraced witchcraft in their narratives, while Goodall rejected this approach. He benefited thus from an ideal combination. His pamphlet style copied witch stereotypes in other pamphlets and ballads about Sawyer, but then the content of his narrative ridiculed witchcraft for grounding the story in a clear Christian warning. No, I don't actually. I won't have time today. But just to note that a play was also produced by Sawyer at the same time in the same year, which presents Sawyer as a kind of sympathetic figure. But like Goodall, the pamphlet on the play, the front page and its narrative do not match, as the front page of the play focuses on the fanciful stories and the actual content is rather sympathetic and kind of downplays the role of witchcraft. So what can we say what does Goodall's pamphlet style and his complaints tell us about the perception of witchcraft in his period? Goodall's pamphlet, I would say, it represents most clearly the dichotomy that existed between popular interest in witchcraft and perceptions of witchcraft among the clergy. In an effort to publicize his message and ensure its popularity, Goodall catered to the stories, specifically to the stories he detested, by engaging readers with an illustration of an archetypal witch, and his title mentioning which the readers recognized. He likely wished to convert readers away from fanciful stories to what he perceived to be dangers to society of cursing, of blaspheming, and accepting the devil. For Goodall, these resulted in the crimes attributed to witchcraft, unexplained deaths, crop failures, etc. The dangers of these sins that Goodall believed had led Sartre to ruin were more immediate lessons that he could teach readers to focus on rather than focusing on magical manifestations of witches. Blasphemy, cursing, or blaspheming were sins that readers may see in themselves or their family. Goodall latched on to the popularity of Elizabeth Sawyer as a witch, playing up the rumours of her magic in his title and woodcut, and he then turned the narrative of witchcraft around to offer a direct message to readers. The message being, do not worry about such fanciful stories so that you may drink or gossip in taverns about magic. Instead, pay attention to yourselves and your family. Correct the minor sins of cursing and blaspheming before you draw the devil towards you, as Sawyer had. Goodall never once condemned Sawyer as a witch or as evil. Instead, he is rather sympathetic. Sawyer is the unfortunate example, Goodall believes, that God has chosen to warn of the sins that are rampant in society that readers need to take heed of and to correct before it's too late. And as Goodall concludes his story, quote, "Dear Christian, the cause and the first time the devil came into her, then she was cursing, swearing, and blaspheming. The devil rageth, and malice reigneth in the hearts of many." Thank you.